Now, lest you think I'm just picking on the South here, let me say this. My ancestors, my great-great-grandfather, Timothy McCune, and his three brothers, John, Pulser, and Daniel, fought for the Confederacy in the Civil War. John was killed early on. Timothy, Pulser, and Daniel apparently were not great soldiers, as they were captured and spent most of the war in a Union POW camp. But here's an interesting little sidebar. My ancestors came here from Northern Ireland more than 100 years before the Civil War. They settled in Western Virginia, which, when the war started, became the Union state of West Virginia. Well, great-great-grandma and grandpa and his brothers and about 9,000 other West Virginians went off and joined the Confederate Army, as we mentioned. After the war, certain Republican elements in Congress were determined to punish the South. They viewed these West Virginians as guilty of treason. Well, they knew they couldn't hang 9,000 traitors, so instead they revoked these folks' U.S. citizenship. This was under Andrew Johnson, who had replaced Lincoln. Old great-great-great-grandma had been living on a pension from her late husband's service in the War of 1812. They sure took that away from her. And basically the family had no rights of citizenship for several years. Finally, when the more rational Ulysses S. Grant became president, he, I think through an executive order, restored everyone's citizenship. So if the family's been here for 300 years, we've only been citizens for 297 of them. In April 1865, the War of the Rebellion came to an end, with Robert E. Lee surrendering to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. And some still wonder, what was it all about? There are Southern apologists who claim that it was about states' rights. There are those who claim it was about tariffs and business, or about preserving the unique culture of Old Dixie. Well, maybe in some ways it was about all those things. But what it really was about was slavery.
Speaking about the Civil War, there is a raging debate that goes on with some degree of seriousness or not, that it was about a concept of states' rights or different interplay of individual rights. Are your rights reposed in the state? Are they not reposed in the state? Or was it all about slavery? It was about slavery. The arguments about states' rights were in the context of wanting to protect the institution in the states from encroachment from the federal government of the rights of slaveholders. The slaveholders in the South were the ones that were in control of the government, and that's what they fought for. It was the right to maintain their institutions. And it's very interesting, if there was really any doubt about that, the mantra during the civil rights movement was not, oh, we should deny black people rights. The mantra of the South in the 1960s was states' rights, states' rights, states' rights. But everybody knew then, as they did in the 1860s, that it wasn't necessarily about states' rights. It was about the rights of human beings and the rights of black people in this country.
How does one sum up this bloodiest American military experience? Lincoln's Gettysburg Address in 1863 is a good start at explaining the underlying purpose of those who died there. He said, 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. That's a line borrowed from Thomas Jefferson. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor powers to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, Remember, this was only halfway through the Civil War. That from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, meaning no slavery, and the government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Incredible, moving. Lincoln, certainly one of the best writers, a poet really in American history. But there was another speech delivered ad lib by an American colonel named Joshua Chamberlain, commander of the 20th Infantry Regiment of Maine. It was the second morning of the Gettysburg Battle. Sent to Chamberlain was a group of soldiers from Maine. Their enlistment had expired, but they were ordered to stay and fight. Today you'd call that a stop-loss. These soldiers refused. It was called a mutiny. Chamberlain and the Union needed these soldiers for what later that day became the Battle of Little Round Top. He gathered the mutinous soldiers together and made his plea. He said to them in part, "This is a different kind of army. If you look at history, you'll see men fight for pay or women or some other kind of loot. They fight for land, power, or because a king makes them, or just because they like killing. But we're here for something new. This has not happened much in the history of the world. We're an army out to set other men free. America should be free ground, all of it, not divided between slave states and free, all the way from here to the Pacific Ocean. No man has to bow, no man born to royalty. Here we judge you by what you do, not by who your father was. Here you can be something. Here is the place to build a home, but it's not the land. There's always more land. It's the idea that we all have value, you and me. What we're fighting for in the end, we're fighting for each other." Well, he did persuade them. The soldiers did join the fight. The significance of the Gettysburg victory was that it ended the South's efforts to move the fight into the northern states. And consider this footnote. Lincoln's Gettysburg Address was about men who had died there for the cause. Chamberlain's little speech was to soldiers who were about to die there for that cause. Eventually, the war was over. It's an interesting footnote to history that General Grant invited Colonel Chamberlain to be the soldier who actually accepted the surrender document from General Lee. Chamberlain eventually retired as a general. He died in 1914. A week after the surrender, April 14, 1865, a Good Friday, Lincoln took a bullet in the head. He died on the 15th. I've always thought of him as the last casualty of the Civil War. Andrew Johnson assumed the presidency. It was over a period of several years that southern states were allowed back in the Union. U.S. troops occupied the South to protect the now freed former slaves and to keep order. Other Northerners, called carpetbaggers, went south to exploit the situation for their personal gain. African Americans found themselves in important Southern governmental positions. Southern whites found themselves resentful.